Desmond does not lead you to see a different world. He leads you to see the world differently.
Yeah.
And I think in his case, what he does is he exposes the rich veins of the metaxu, where the secret essence of existence and creation of life and the drama of life and death pulse at all times. And he awakens within us the sense that the world is not simply inertly there, a block, but it is held gratuitously in this trembling web of being, and that all that is shimmers and shines with that beauty. And when we have eyes opened to seeing it, the world is like this diaphanous, revelatory site for encounters with the divine.
Yeah.
And there's something so arresting of that, especially in an age where we face such ecological, social degradation.
Oh,
This is a way of seeing one another, the Imago Dei. Pope Francis had called like an integral ecology of the way the world is held together in this intimate web. And Desmond gives us such a powerful way, a powerful metaphysic to appreciate that more deeply and robustly.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Circling Dialogos. If you are inspired by what we talk about on this channel and want to dive deeper and in fellowship with others, there's a number of ways you can do that. One is to become my client and work one-on-one with me. We also have circling events every week open to the public. We also do weekend intensives for circling every 4 to 6 weeks or so. And we have a year-long Art of Circling practitioner training program. We also have self-study programs that you can do at your own pace. All the relevant links, including my email, is below in the show notes. Please let me know if you have any questions.
I'm so happy to have you here, my friend.
Thank you, Guy, for having me.
Remind me of the specific title of the book that you wrote.
So, actually,
There it is.
Spiritual Exercises for a Secular Age,
Yeah.
Desmond and the Quest for God.
Yeah.
And this is an outworking of the dissertation project I wrote under the Blessed Trinity at Boston College. My advisor, Brian Robinette, Richard Carney, and Dominic Doyle. So I got representation from 3 different areas of the university: philosophy, theology, and the School of Theology and Ministry.
Wow. Yeah. And I was just saying that a couple of things we were talking about, like just my encounter with Desmond, in the sense that I feel like in some way he's addressing the matter of our times. He got his finger right on that pressure point in a way that I think is quite profound. And
I think
yeah. And what's interesting is reading your book, right? One is I sense there's a sentence in your book where you mentioned Desmond's work is not that well known currently.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I felt a resonance with what I hear as an urgency for his work to get out there and in the ways that you're talking about it. And I think your book is like this really interesting way that you draw Desmond out in the philosophic sense, the ancient sense of philosophy. And you talk a lot about in that book that Desmond is actually not just informing us, but forming us in reading it, in practicing it. And you really take this and draw out this exercised element, this transformational element of philosophia in a sense, which is something that I have struggled to describe, right? Groped to describe of my experience of reading Heidegger for the first time and like having all kinds of reading disorders and learning disabilities and stuff like that. But something called me there, but it wasn't so much what I learned from Heidegger in terms of information is what it took to understand Heidegger or not understand Heidegger was this forming process, right, that translated into what I was doing. I started something called circling, right, that it started to give me hands to actually address the excess of what I was experiencing in that practice and bring language to it and all kinds of things that that has led to. So the first thing I want to just really name is I get the sense that you have as Merleau Ponty would say, optimal grip on the thing that I think is really important in addressing philosophy as such, and especially what I think Desmond's work is calling on us to do.
No, thank you for that. I agree. You use two words that I find extraordinarily compelling, namely encounter and then a sense of calling. And that's ultimately what I find so compelling about Desmond's work. Desmond is not writing, and he says this at the very beginning of Being in the Between, that this is a work on metaphysics, but it's also in metaphysics. Ultimately, he is inviting you to an encounter that begins to reorient the way we understand and interact with the world around us. And that's where I think that notion of encounter is so important. There's a way of meeting with, or Desmond will often use the word companioning, to be a companion thinker with him. And what he's doing is not giving you an itemized list of, oh, isn't this an interesting historical bit of information? And, oh, as everyone knows, Heidegger says this, and as everyone knows, Hegel says this. Instead, he's saying, stop looking at the world through the protective lens of the aquarium glass and take the risk of plunging in, getting wet, and re-experiencing things for the first time, for anew, really, as if it were for the first time.
Yeah.
And that's what I think that level of encounter is so compelling about him, because it's invitatory. He's not telling you something. He's saying, journey with me, think with me, walk with me, and begin to see the world anew. And that, I think, is the exhilaration of reading Desmond. Sometimes confounding and bamboozling, but at the same time, richly rewarded,
Yeah,
because it opens our eyes to see in a new way.
totally. And I would imagine you're a Jesuit priest.
Yes.
Yeah. Could I ask you, how long have you been committed as a priest?
Sure. So as it happens, Friday, June 13th was my 10th anniversary of ordination.
Oh, wow.
And I entered the Society of Jesus in August of 2004. So I'm approaching my 21st anniversary of religious life.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah. Before we dive deep into your text, I want to hear, actually, in what way does it make sense that you would end up writing this book? Like, how did that's a really big question.
Yeah. I think it makes sense on a couple levels. Here's the narrative in a way. I had never heard of William Desmond.
Yeah.
He's a fellow Irishman. I'm a professional Irish musician in addition to
Yeah.
a Jesuit priest and professor. And I was studying German in Austria in 2011 or 12, and a fellow Jesuit who was studying in Belgium said, "Oh, my dissertation director is William Desmond." I said, "Oh, the name meant nothing to me." But he said he teaches metaphysics. It's called metaxology, and for whatever reason, that word stuck in my head. So that night, went back. We'd gone to a bar and had a couple of drinks, and I came home and I did what any scholar does today. I Googled William Desmond metaxology, and just from that wee little Wikipedia page,
Mm.
I was captivated. And I remember waking up that night with the word metaxology ringing in my mind. And I thought, there's something here. So I ordered immediately the Christopher Ben Simpson's The William Desmond Reader, and
Yeah.
undertook that process of immersing myself in this man's thought.
Mm.
Now, while I was doing this, I have been so blessed to have been formed by really incredible thinkers. And my good friend and hero is Brian Robinette at Boston College. And Brian is the most generous, marvelous thinker you'll ever meet. Like kind and capacious, and he's a dude.
Mm.
And Brian helped me to name the importance of like discovered Pierre Hadot and the idea of spiritual exercise that is even underneath the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, and to see the study of theology, the study of philosophy, even the study of literature as an immersive exercise that forms the way we think and see the world and how we interact with it. So with having taken class with Brian Robinette and Richard Carney in the philosophy department, Dominic Doyle, Richard Lennon, Grant Kaplan, these are all these great like guy thinkers. Iris Murdoch, reading a lot of her writing too, certainly Charles Taylor. All of them were converging in a way that I noticed that as I read and as I thought and as I studied, the way I saw the world was changing in really interesting ways.
Yeah.
And thanks to Brian and Pierre Hadot, I said, oh, this text is a spiritual exercise.
Yeah.
And that's how it's working.
Yeah.
And that gave me the framework to begin to negotiate it.
Yeah. So it
And-
sounds like, it sounds like
you
what I'm hearing is that you were already having the experience, right, of
Yeah.
a shift in how you saw and sensed the world, right, through philosophy.
Yes.
And in some sense, encountering Hadot and others named what was already transpiring in you, perhaps, and gave it distinction. So it really brought it out into the foreground in some sense. Is that
Right.
accurate?
No, that's a great way of putting it. There's something very, I guess you would say, like a posteriori. I was writing a dissertation that tried to explain my own experience
Yeah.
in a way that would serve, I guess, as an a priori way of
Right.
inciting or enkindling that experience for others. And that's Dominic Doyle from the Klaus School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College once shared a piece of wisdom that his director, Michael Buckley, offered him. And it was this. He said, the quality of a dissertation is directly proportional to the quality of the question it sets out to answer. And so for me, the question was, like what Charles Taylor is doing and what Desmond is doing.
Yeah.
These are really big, important issues. So how is it that they have so transformed my imagination
Yeah.
in a way that I think is so life-giving and so consistent and consonant with a larger Christian theological tradition and a Western philosophical tradition? So let me investigate how this works.
Yeah.
And that ultimately that's I think even as a thinker, I'm always interested in how something works. Like, what is it doing? How does it perform? What's
Yeah.
it making?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
that's what I found.
Yeah. Yeah. So so there was it's really interesting, the thing that you said about the question. The quality of the question is the most determinant of the quality of the work that you end up. And it's interesting because what I'm hearing is that I think you even talk about this in your book about the way that Desmond talks about what a question is, right? And there's a real mystery to a question in a sense, because at some level you're like, it acknowledges a lack. I don't know the answer, thus the question, right? So the very lack constitutes the question, but somehow I know to ask a question, right? So the very answer to the question at some level is present or intimate in me, right?
Yeah.
There's a betweenness, right, in the very question itself that I sense is not just epistemological but ontological, and I'm getting that sense in your almost like I'm almost seeing this kind of fractal nature of where you were personally in your encounters, right? I would imagine with philosophy, I would also imagine with religion, and probably lots of things that were transforming you. Yet not totally distinct until you saw, it sounds like Hado, and then when you saw the word Metaxu, like it's somehow it's interesting. There's a sense of, I recently saw something, I'll put it like this, digress for 1 second just to frame this. There's a TED talk out, I think it was like 6-7 years ago, where they were trying to study how the child acquires language, logos. What they did is they set up cameras in this house that recorded every single moment of the child's life in the house and was tracking the sound. And what was really interesting of what they discovered is that the child was trying to say water. And there's this period of time where they pick up if the child's trying to say water, or the phoneme anyways of water, and it's struggling to do that until one of the adults hears them attempting to say it. And the moment that happens, there's this meeting. And then they trace the activity, and there's all this activity of this meeting, and they track all the places where this child is tracking the water. And you watch the progress. They have this way of like graphing it out, but you watch the of how accurate the child says it is really slow until it meets the relation. It's when, now they didn't put it like this, how I would put it is that it was when the parent or the caregiver saw the child, that seeing drew the child out, and there was this kind of mutual reciprocal co-dwelling that then it went right up in this sense. And it's funny because I'm getting something similar as you're talking about Desmond and Hado, right? There's certain phone names that you were practicing, I'm imagining, right? They were conscious, right? But not totally distinct. And then something like that happened. It addressed you.
It was. I find the style of Desmond's writing, which I know can be off-putting to some people because it's not artificially clear. Desmond is a rigorous writer, he's a rigorous thinker, but he's a poetic thinker. So his words are working on you. But the working itself, to your point about the acquisition of language, here you have really a maieutic midwifing process. As you read Desmond and as you give yourself over to the text, and we of course have to be careful about how we give ourselves over, but in that surrender and that co-facilitation of a new language being tutored into this foreign language of metaxology, things are revealed that you hadn't seen before. I use the phrase, I love plays on language. Desmond does not lead you to see a different world. He leads you to see the world differently.
Yeah.
And I think in his case, what he does is he exposes the rich veins of the metaxu, where the secret essence of existence and creation, of life and the drama of life and death pulse at all times. And he awakens within us the sense that the world is not simply inertly there, a block, but it is held gratuitously in this trembling web of being, and that all that is shimmers and shines with that beauty. And when we have eyes opened to seeing it, the world is like this diaphanous, revelatory site for encounters with the divine.
Yeah.
And there's something so arresting of that, especially in an age where we face such ecological, social degradation. This is a way of seeing one another, the imago Dei. Pope Francis had called like an integral ecology of the way the world is held together in this intimate web. And Desmond gives us such a powerful way, a powerful metaphysic to appreciate that more deeply and robustly.
Yeah. Like a powerful metaphysic. Before I want to dive into the notion of metaphysics, because that's a big kind of grappling struggle, right? Which if you're familiar with Heidegger and postmodernism and all that stuff, metaphysics has become a bad word, right?
Yeah.
And what you're talking about is, in a certain sense, is I think what you're really highlighting is a kind of mindfulness, a metaphysical mindfulness, right? That one can actually have in the total mundane, right? There's a mindfulness, a metaphysical mindfulness, which is such an evocative sense, right? Of there's something so evocative about that sense of being like mindful, like metaphysically mindful. This his use of the word mindfulness has this, I don't know, this present-centered living in eminence ways of appropriating, accounting for, in intimacy with what is most ultimate and the most ordinary in this, the way that he instantiates. Yeah. But
No,
before we go into that, I'm curious, is there anything you can share with us about, really curious about how one comes to the decision to essentially dedicate their life to religion, to a faith?
yeah.
A little bit about that. I would imagine is pretty relevant to what we're talking
It
about.
is. It's something on an anniversary you can't help but think about it.
Yeah.
I come from Cleveland, Ohio, oldest of 5 kids, mom and dad. Religion was a topic
Midwestern
in our
boy.
family. Pardon?
Midwestern boy too, huh? I'm from Chicago.
Midwestern boy, man. I'm all in the
Yeah.
Midwest. Midwest is best.
Yeah.
And my dad had gone to college to become a Lutheran pastor, but met my mother, and that changed. My mom's very Irish and very Catholic. And religion was taken seriously in our family, not in an overbearing way at all, but it was a topic of conversation. Why do we choose what we do, and the significance of faith? And those were live questions.
Wow.
And as I went through high school, I went to a Jesuit all-boys school, St. Ignatius High School in Cleveland. And I had really good teachers there who were Jesuits and who helped me to understand the credibility of faith. I went to Canisius College, where I went to study chemistry. And there again, under the influence of these really fine Jesuit teachers, I discovered a love I didn't know I had for the type of questioning and reflection that theology occasioned. At the same time, I was playing Irish music professionally and trying to discern just who I was meant to be in my life. And at some point, I realized that as I looked at the kind of man I wanted to become, my Jesuit teachers gave me an example of wisdom, integrity, of commitment, of joy, and like this sense of joy and happiness that I said, I want something of that. And there, I think, maybe, I mean, it's not that I never thought about being a regular parish priest in the Diocese of Cleveland, but the Jesuits gave me a way of thinking about my sense of calling where it wasn't what I would do, a title or a position, but rather who I was in my identity. And in my case, it was, I saw myself most as a friend and companion of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I've always been deeply compelled in my prayer and certainly in my teaching with the life and ministry of Jesus, how he interacted with others,
Yeah.
the way that he looked and beheld, the way he held and touched, the way he spoke, his imagination as revealed in the parables. And that all of that shaped who I am and has contributed to certainly my pastoral instincts and intuitions and ministry, but also to my intellectual formation. Because I just came from the Catholic Theological Society of America. There are a lot of scholars who know a lot more than I do, and they can rattle off dates and names and debates and conflicts far better than I can. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's the type, I really laud that kind of work. But what I'm more interested in is thinking along with other thinkers and certainly my reader in a way that allows them an opportunity to experience discovery or to have an encounter with the divine that awakens something within.
Yeah. So it sounds like that a lot of it, as you said, was your encounters and relationships with the Jesuit priests in your life, right? In school.
Yes.
There was some way that transmitted something to you and gave an example of how you wanted, not just what you wanted to do, but what I heard you say is how you wanted to be.
Yeah. What I would say too, the Jesuits, so the Society of Jesus, when St. Ignatius
Yeah.
conceived of this with his first companions, he saw the Jesuits, and we see ourselves as a missionary order, and we are who are available to be missioned anywhere in the world to do anything that, in our language, will help souls, which will help people know their worth, know their value, their human dignity, and to
Wow.
flourish.
Wow.
Now, I am the first to admit I am not adept at speaking other languages. I'm pretty good at reading, but when it comes to spoken language, I can get by in Spanish.
Yeah.
And I discovered, though, as a teacher, first of high school students and then of college students, that my identity as a missionary is, in a way, to be a missionary of the imagination and to reach into and interact with the way students and readers and thinkers or viewers imagine the world,
Yeah.
and to help inform it
Yeah.
in a way that I think is distinctively inspired by the gospel.
Yeah.
And I find life in that the idea of being a missionary of the imagination has been something that I have prayed and thought about a lot of late. And it seems to capture pretty well my impulses.
I feel, it's funny, I feel quite moved by what you're talking about. I really am appreciating. I think part of what's moving is that I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm hearing you talk about like your life and what's happened to you. But there's a way in which I can feel something in an openness in you that is just felt. I don't know if I can put it into words, that your words are articulating and just animating something that's really present. So I really appreciate that a lot. And I'm also really appreciating what I'm hearing is like your life in so many regards and what's affected you, what's guided your choices, and is actually, it's what I'm hearing is deeply relational.
I think about a lot the Genesis 1:26, the Imago Dei.
Yeah.
And I was reading one of our doctoral students wrote a paper, and there in his paper, he's arguing that Imago Dei only focuses on rationality.
Yeah.
And I was reading it as I flew out to Portland for the meeting, and I kept crossing that out and saying it's not rationality, it's relationality. It's our capacity for relationship.
Yeah.
That I think ultimately from the side of the Christian anthropology, it's not that we're thinking things.
Yeah.
Descartes knew that. But I think deep down, our imago Dei is that we are inherently and essentially relational beings, and we are only fulfilled when we are in full communion in relationship. The Trinity is the blessed Trinity. It's joy overflowing joy as God delights in the divine self. And then that is freely given in the act, the letting be of creation. And our imago Dei is that we are capable not only of knowing it, but of participating in communion with it. And I, just as a teacher, and I meet with students or people as I travel who are lonely, anxious, afraid, depressed because they don't know their own worth, their own value as humans. And I think there's a problem with relationality here. It's not that they're reasonable, they're not irrational, they're alienated. And I think to his enduring credit, that's where Desmond is so helpful, is he resinks our minds and our hearts into the firmament of the metaxu that is itself an expression of relationship.
Yeah, totally. So there's like what I'm hearing is like, I'm hearing like really like basically a relational ontology and and it
Yes.
sounds like a dwelling mindfulness of that relational ontology that has really been a practice, but also I'm hearing is you dwell with people that transmitted that to you. Well, can I ask you more about those? Some of those people, like the Jesuits, like you mentioned that they demonstrated a kind of wisdom and a compassion. And I think you used a bunch of other really beautiful words, right? Can you say more? So what were they like? Like, in what way did they embody that with you? Was it in how they responded to you? Is it how they paid attention to you? Was it how they instructed you?
Yeah, I would say, I'm mindful that we're talking about Desmond, and that's part of, and I so appreciate this question because in my heart, it is reminding me of probably why I ultimately gravitate so close to Desmond and to, I would say, like my theological hero, Karl Rahner, Rene Girard, too. These are deeply relational thinkers. But with the Jesuits, they were, at the risk of a barbarous phrase, they were non-dominative. They were not trying to impose something on me. Their way of being was to let me be me. And even when they saw that I was doing something stupid or like going off the rail a bit intellectually, like my behavior was always pretty good. They weren't like I
Yeah.
was doing wild and things.
Yeah.
But they had the freedom to let me understand my freedom and to ask my questions and to wrestle at the Jabbok Ford when I needed to wrestle with God, and they didn't step in. And that built up, I would say, something of a spiritual and theological resilience
Wow.
that was powering at the time and has empowered me since.
Yeah.
That the struggle is okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
That the struggle is it's a sign of life. Friction is a sign of life,
Yeah.
and to be a man of discernment.
Yeah.
So such that when I have prayed and worked hard to allow the Spirit to move within me and to call me, even if it seems difficult or arduous, to trust in that sense of call, always revising as needed, but to believe that God has called and is asking for cooperation in some great work that I might not get my mind around, but that I'm still called to lend my hands and heart to. And that has made such a world of difference, certainly in my scholarship, in my teaching, but also in just the pastoral presence that I tried to have.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. There was something that
They let me,
there's a bunch of things you said, but one of them was this, I think, this sense to hear the call, right?
it, and it's always here the,
Calling.
and that, and because so many people I run into have this idea that God calls in one direction, one way, one time only, and if you miss it. And I simply don't agree with that. I think God is, for Jesuits, God is discoverable in all things, can be sought in all things. That the surgeon and the sanitation worker have each one can be a manifestation of one's willingness to respond to where God has called you to use your gifts and talents to build up the kingdom. And so I could have been a medical doctor, and I think that would have been a good career, and that calling would have led me in a different direction. As a Jesuit priest, I feel I 10 years as a priest, and I'm still being called, and that calling is leading me deeper and deeper. And the willingness to continue to listen for and to answer
Yeah.
that has
Yeah.
made life something of an adventure,
Yeah.
and one that I appreciate being on.
Would it be fair to say that the Jesuit like priests that deeply impacted you? It sounds like what you said is like they basically like really had a kind of Socratic Gelassenheit, right? Like listening of you. It's really interesting because I would imagine at some level, like the, how were they already holding you or listening in the deepest sense of the word, right? To you such that they could respond and hear the struggle that you were in and want you to realize it, like in a kind of a midwifing sense, I'm really hearing Socrates, right? Not necessarily
Is that again?
I know Plato, right? Interpretation, but the enactment in the dialogues that Socrates continually manifested. I'm hearing that spirit. And what's interesting about that is, and it sounds like it reciprocally that that listening that they indwelled in you, are now indwelling out of that towards the world, right? That sense, it's really something quite beautiful about what you're describing and how it's showing up in my imagination as we're speaking.
But I think that's the call for all of us, right? To be almost like radio transmitters and relay stations, that the message we receive, we can broadcast out.
Yeah.
And some of us are fortunate to be able to relay it really broadly, and some do it in smaller circles of influence. I look at the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, and in the prefatory notes, as he's like his message to the person who's going to give the spiritual exercises to the recipient, he has some words of wisdom in the 15th, we call them annotations. He sees the spiritual director's role as to be one of equanimity, of standing in balance, because your stability and your freedom empowers the stability and freedom of the person undergoing the exercises and receiving the exercises. And I think there's something very important about that. The Jesuits I knew they didn't try to make me into something else.
Yeah.
There was no manipulation.
Yeah.
There was attention and appreciation.
Yeah.
And because they let me be me,
Yeah.
I could discover who I was. Their freedom gave me freedom. There is the Gelassenheit, that releasement of, I'll let you be.
Yeah.
Not because I don't care, but because I love and respect you enough to.
Yeah.
But isn't that creation? The primordial act of a creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. This divine letting be that says, I love you enough to not only create you, but to continue to create you and to accompany you. But I'm not going to dominate. I'm not going to compel. I will call. I think there's love there.
Yeah.
And so I'm grateful for the love that was shown and not just the Jesuits, but I had mentor teachers who, I think back to some of my early theology teachers, Beck Craywick at Canisius College, or Joan Newth at John Carroll University, Howard Gray and Walter Farrell. They were both Jesuits. Brian Robinette, Richard Carney. These guys they had appropriated the sense of our freedom lets you be free.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's such a gift.
Free. Yeah. Yeah. It's gorgeous just thinking about freedom as a letting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you think, if you consider that God's primordial act of creation is a letting be, a divine letting be, motivated not out of selfish gain, not to work out God's divine issues, a la some versions of Hegel, but simply as an extension of this loving let be.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, then all the world is a gift, and all the world is the stage on which that gift gets played out. And we're part of that, and we have a role to play in it.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
This
Absolutely.
is a different vision of God that a lot of people have, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really interesting because I think is what Vervaeke would call, what I'm hearing is the way that you're talking about is almost the opposite of kind of propositional tyranny, right? It's like what has this quality of a proposition, right? Like can be tyrannical, like this kind of top down sense, which many religions, right? Many sects have deeply fallen into that, but you're talking about something really different, right? Really different. And what's interesting, yeah. And what I'm hearing is really interesting is about the kind of the path that your life has taken is that you are now from that relationship. I'm really glad that we talked about how you came into this, because what I'm hearing is out of that kind of deep relationality, right? And then philosophy comes in. And what is things like propositions and philosophical doctrines and thinkers and thought, which especially as we get more modern, becomes a kind of its own version of an academic tyranny and different.
The change of the footnote.
Yeah, totally. But I really get the sense of that something's already really clear in the matter for you when you start to approach philosophy in that sense. And that really comes through. And it's funny, like looking at the book that you wrote, it makes so much sense as I'm talking to you.
Oh, good. The so if this is an issue that relates to something we were dealing with, faculty contracts. I'm the department chair, so that's one of those the things that you don't get prepared for in doctoral studies, things like budgets and contract negotiations and such. But the distinction between a relational approach and a transactional approach, and it seems to me, in again coming from an academic conference, that there is a lot of academic transaction. You are only as good as the sources that you cite, and you only count so long as you're within my citation ghetto. And you have credibility because we cite the same people, we read the same sources, we agree on the same things. And that level of transaction, fine. But that's one of Desmond's great little lines. He says, you read these scholars who spend the first half of their work like loading themselves up with Heideggerian chains only to basically like link by link take them off. And to say, oh, I don't need that. And you go, bloody well, just say something. Like go on and
Yes.
take the risk of saying something interesting.
Yeah.
That's a huge risk, especially in the academy today, because we all, I think, are somehow trained and maybe even encouraged to think that we're the emperors with no clothes.
Right.
And that people will, if we take off our footnotes, they're going to see that we're really naked and underneath.
In fact, you make a point, and I think in the introduction of your book, of that you were really trying to keep the notes as minimal as possible. You really, if it needs to be said, it needs to be said in the text. You really made a point of that in the introduction. And I'm hearing you readdress that again.
I look at as I page through, let the reader beware. There are footnotes. There are many footnotes because you're dealing with other thinkers, and there are 200 and some odd footnotes in one of the chapters. But I try never to carry on those secondary conversations off book. And there are thinkers who you're reading the text and then the other text, which is the footnotes where all the conversation elsewhere is happening. I get it, but life is short. I want to know where you said something, but I don't want to read another. Like I'm already reading your chapter. Why do I want to read the second chapter that you didn't think to write?
Yeah.
I know it's cranky. It's my own academic frustration.
Yeah.
But excessive footnotes.
Yeah. Totally.
Look at Desmond.
Yeah.
You could do desire, dialectic, and otherness, and there are very few footnotes. And he says, I wanted to write a dissertation that I didn't have to, I wasn't going to use a lot of footnotes. I just wanted to do the thing that we're most afraid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, and that's maybe, and
It's interesting. You like a chosen vulnerability I'm hearing with this.
yes, there is. Desmond, here's the thing. I would say this, and I think Karl Rahner is this way. I think Girard, in his own unique way, a thinker like John Macquarie, the theologian, I would call them, they're finger paint thinkers.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever said that before. Like, they're not paint by numbers where you get the stencil out and then you fill it all in.
Yeah.
Quite to the contrary. They're like, they throw something onto the page, and then they're moving things around, and you don't exactly know where it's going to go.
Yeah.
And you'll notice, like, Desmond doesn't, you'd be rare to find what today academics would call the thesis statement. You write that introductory paragraph 4 after your intro, where you say, in this paper, I will do the following.
Yes.
He's not going to do that.
Yeah.
Desmond's going to take you on a ride.
Yeah.
And ride is him, like, he's got his concepts. He's going to talk about some Aristotle. He's going to throw Plato in there. He's going to hit Kant and Hegel.
Yeah.
Maybe a little Heidegger, depending on his mood, whoever. He's going to move that page around and then say, oh, look, we'll bring in this speaker here. And all of a sudden, this really interesting arc forms that you didn't quite expect.
Yeah.
And you're taking on this ride. You're going, yeah, all right, I'm with you, man.
Yeah, exactly. And that ride.
That's what
is as much a part of it than the thing actually being stated. It's the ride that you go on in it being stated that is is in some sense the deepest point.
So, like, I'm reading my bedside reading, so my bedroom's just back that way. But on my nightstand is Catherine Lacunia's masterful God for Us. I read that book 20 years ago, and today I can go back. I can read the opening paragraph or two, and I can read the summary at the end, and I get the content of the chapter. Can't do that with Desmond. Cannot do that with Desmond. Desmond is not presenting the history of something.
Yeah.
He's making a sustained, implicating argument. He's going to draw you in and say, look, try to put this on. See, does it fit?
Yeah.
You have to walk around in it.
Yeah. Relate.
It's
Yeah.
try before you buy.
Yeah, totally. Relate with it. There's that kind of relational sense to him. He's funny because I just had a conversation with him. I think I just published it a week ago or something. And I was really curious about his experience of writing. And he said something really interesting. He said, the more I write, the less I know what happened. And the less I know how that happened. It's like there was blooming, there was an opening. And then I apparently was part of it at some point, but I cannot for the life of you tell you how I did it in that sense. And I thought that was so exemplary and telling of the process of writing as you undergo it in some sense.
Desmond, I have a deep affection for him as a person. And I was so happy I got to go to his retirement party and have been with him on occasions since then. But Desmond is, I think, in our contemporary age, the incarnation of what Denise Levertov thinks of poets, that they are servants of mystery.
Yeah.
And he is. It's again non-dominative. There's something very oriented towards serving that over-determined presence, that mystery at the heart of creation, in a way that is reverential, that is humble, that is keen on. Desmond does not attack other thinkers. You'll never see Desmond say, "This is nonsense," or "Oh, what a stupid thing." He's too generous. He reverences, even those I think he would strongly disagree with. He's not going to say that's nonsense and don't take them seriously. He respects people too much for that. And I really admire that in a thinker. But I think it's because he's a servant of mystery. And he doesn't think he speaks because he feels he has been addressed and spoken to.
Yeah.
And that gives it, there's a mystical quality to Desmond. It's a mystagogical metaphysic that leads you. It's not, again, it's the philosopher Mary Midgley was critical of aquarium viewing. Like we see through the porthole and say, oh, isn't that an interesting sight? And then we go to another one. Oh, isn't that an interesting sight? Sure. But
Kind of like
he
shopping.
wants you to get in. Yeah. Yes. Like online shopping without ever trying anything on. It looks good on the dummy. Don't be a dummy. Go put it on.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Totally. I'm curious for you. Now, I know that you've also recently wrote I think just came out with a book that looked so compelling to me. Was it horror? Like, was that horror was I'm really bad with remembering names and stuff, but what's the most recent book?
You think I have nothing else on my shelves but my book? But
Yeah.
Theology of Horror.
Horror. Yeah. Wow.
But even there, the hidden depths.
Hidden depths.
The hidden depths.
Yeah.
Of popular films. And
yeah,
look, I always say, again, missionary the imagination. I'm trying my best to engage. That book, it is not quite a fundamental theology, but it's pretty bloody close. And it starts with the Blair Witch Project and the sense that what do we do? Aristotle, all humans desire to know, and we ask questions.
Yeah.
And Desmond figures in this book, Rene Girard, lots of Ronner. Those are my big three, Iris Murdoch on the imagination. And but it's a journey. So just before coming to start this interview today, I was with a former student who was in that class,
Right.
who took the class because she loved horror movies. And then she's, oh my God, this was
Yeah.
amazing, because there was God all over the place. And
Yeah.
it's very Jesus centered. I'm a Jesus-y person.
Mm.
But that through line of a pilgrimage into the abyssal depths of the darkness,
Yes.
turns out we find lots of light.
Yeah.
And so I wanted students to take an unorthodox journey to discover some pretty orthodox positions.
Yeah.
And teaching it was fun.
Yeah.
I wish I could write it again, and maybe I'll do the sequel.
Yeah.
I saw the publisher, the acquisitions editor, this last weekend, and I said, would you be open to a sequel? And she goes, I would be very open to a sequel, because it sold really well for an academic book.
Yeah.
And I said, could I call it There Are No Moral Relativists in Horror? And she said, you could write a sequel. You can title it that. And she, like, her eyes did the, no. But when you think about it, you have young adults. Look, today we tell students, that's their truth and that's what they want. And I said to my class, if Leatherface is going to come running after you, there is not one of you who's going to say, I guess that's his truth.
Yeah.
Who am I to judge?
Yeah.
No, you're going to say, hell out of here. That's the conceit of horror movies. Otherwise, it would just be very boring, no suspense, because people would just held off. Because the killer's living his truth, man.
That's so compelling. There's no more relevance in horror, because horror isn't basically like horror. It's deeply connected to wonder, isn't it? It's almost like the underside of wonder. I know Vervaeke talks about, if you increase wonder and you just kept cranking it up, at some point you'd encounter horror. It's the same.
Yes. It's a phenomenology of Rudolf Otto. Mysterium fascinans ad tremendum. It's what fascinates and draws me in is that the same thing that and it's that systole diastole. And, in horror, I say in the book, and I always tell people, horror is the most conservative genre. Conservative, beyond of conservative, because it presumes a sense of normality and a status quo that we are desperate to preserve. And and where the horror erupts, ER and IRR, is in the threat to the status quo that we are desperate to preserve. Robin Wood, the film theorist, says normality is threatened by the monster. And that's true. The monstrous is what threatens to disrupt the normality as we understand it, as we enjoy it.
Wow.
And that's the midnight swim turns into Chrissy being ravaged by a shark in Jaws.
Yeah.
The status quo of I go for a restful night of sleep is threatened and subverted by Freddy Krueger's ingress into the dreams turned nightmares. The summer sleepaway camp experience is subverted with a crazed and grieving mother, a revenant, hockey mask wearing, a machete wielding man who seems not to die. All of these things we take a sense of normalcy, of normality, and that's why the viewer, it has to be a status quo the viewer can understand.
Yes.
That's what makes the distinction between, say, science fiction and horror. Science fiction, Chewbacca fits into the world of Star Wars, so does Jabba the Hutt. But I'll tell you right now, if Chewbacca came walking in this door, I'd be out that window. Because this is not where he belongs.
Yeah.
And Chewbacca's not the cleaning lady. Get this,
Totally.
this disruption, what is normal.
Yeah. That is really this opening. This opening and this perplexity that opens up.
And
yeah.
So, the late David Tracy, recently deceased, with his, and I think I use this conceit throughout the text, and I think it will be something with me for a while. The notion of the fragment and the frag event. The fragment is both a residue.
Yeah.
It's something that is left over in the aftermath of a break-in.
Yeah.
It is also a verb, an event of a breaking apart. And that frag event, as he calls it, disrupts what had been whole, and in that disruption gives us a glimpse of from the finite to the infinite, from the immanent to the transcendent.
Yeah.
Descartes' third meditation. That's, I think, Thomas Aquinas too. I think Aquinas, when you read the 5 ways as fragments, because they're short, wee little things. Question 2, Article 3. They're short things meant to fragment. They're fragments that fragment.
Yeah.
Fragments that fragment the closed world, stable picture, and lead us to a sense of an awakening of the mystery beneath the created order. So they're profoundly apophatic, and mystagogical at the same time, because they're fragmenting what we assumptions and getting us to see the infinite from the standpoint.
Yeah.
So they don't work. They're not proofs that prove. They're probings that show that beneath the apparent, there's something ineffable.
Total. It's interesting as you're talking. I think you're having me I don't know, not but more deeply understand my own history in a sense.
Think more.
I've never quite thought about it like this. So I grew up 2 amazing people, parents that were also alcoholics and drug addicts. My dad had a lot of rage, especially when he would black out, and that rage was a persistent, always possible thing in my life. And there was violence and all the things that can go with that went with that. What was amazing is I had a grandfather who was extraordinary and just poured himself into me in very much the ways, now that I think about it, in very much in his own kind of German way, the Jesuits did with you. That I think there's some parallels there, but there's nothing like this. I don't think there's a particular sensation of horror that comes when, like, the face of the guy who is your whole nervous system is designed to be seen and guided by and loved by and protected. And when all of a sudden he goes away and then someone else shows up, and that someone else has nothing but benevolence for you, right?
Yeah.
That turn, right, is like that turn of event, that rip in the fabric it's a particular kind of horror, right? At the deepest level. But it's interesting because I've done therapy and I can talk about all that stuff, right? And I don't really get upset because I've really worked through a lot of this, but you're helping me understand why so much of my life has been guided by a sense of wonder, right? At a deep level of like just exploring almost I would say to degrees that have sometimes not been the best for me in various ways, but like this deep, both like respect and fascination for what is ineffable and terrifying at a certain level. This kind of sense of there is no solid ground in the way that everyone thinks there is, or something like that. There is a different kind of ground, like an opening to that and the wonder of that. Actually, it's funny, you just helped me realize a link back to my own history of what was a big part of that opening up for me in my life in a big way.
Thank you for sharing that. That is beautiful. And this is one of those places where you see the relationship between, in a way, like what we study when people ask, what good is philosophy for? It's very good because it does connect back to our lives and our stories. I can't help but think when I said earlier, I'm always compelled and convicted by the healing ministry of Jesus. But the man born blind, in John's gospel, when questioned by the authorities, is he a sinner? And they go, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. All I know is that I was blind and now I see. But can you imagine, like, a person or the cripple at the pool of Siloam who just wants to dip his hand in because he thinks the cure is there, and day after day he can't get in.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden he has someone who sees him on his terms. The woman with the hemorrhage, Bartimaeus, people who have been ignored and walked past, all of a sudden, and what we would consider a horrifying life becomes their status quo. But how terrifying. And then you even just take one other little example, the parable of the prodigal son. This son, what compels me The son, even he was in control when he told his father, I would just wish you were dead. Give me the inheritance. He goes off and squanders it. He still entertains the illusion of control as he's coming back. In the parable, I will go to my father and I will tell him, I no longer deserve to be your son. He still thinks he's in charge and he's trying to set the parameters. I lost the status quo. It devolved into this horror show. And I'm going to try to keep that narrative intact as I come back to my father. And the father is having none of it. That's the horror. Can you imagine the dumbfounded, overwhelming response? Son, you're not in control. This is my story, my house. Kill the fatted calf. Tomorrow's a new day. That's a horror story in the most astounding, astonishing, rock you back on your heels. That's a God, the letting be. I let you be, and I welcome you back.
Yeah.
And that, I think that for your grandfather, that form of healing self-giving, that healing kenosis, that didn't replace or substitute fully for a father, but nevertheless is present as that sustaining letting be that let you be you and encourage you to be you. There's something beautiful about that that makes sense in a much more metaphysical world picture.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah, totally. Yeah. 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 And there's something about, I think for me that there was like something about though, because I could actually see maybe a different kind of temperamental person. Like what I could imagine them, somebody just trying to really get a grip on things and go more like towards the control route. But it was so funny. There was something about that turn, right? That was always, I would try to predict it. By the way, my dad and my mom died 40 years sober, and my dad's been sober before dirt at this point, and we have a really good relationship and all that stuff, right? A lot of healing. But in terms of what happened back there, there was something about where I couldn't rationally or even in an attunement way predict when it would come. And it's something about this, right? And I think this is what I think Lacan talks about this a little bit, but I think it is a really good point because a lot of people think about things like trauma, right, are from kind of incidences in the past. But in some way, that's not incorrect. But I think what it is that those incidences open up a possibility of that happening in the future, which is what you actually dwell in. And it's that anticipation of that happening, which is where all the formation, it's not just those events. If it was just those events without opening up a possible horizon, it's that horizon that was so forming of things in a sense.
It's like Heidegger's anticipatory resoluteness in a way,
Yeah.
projecting forward. This is what we anticipate, and we're almost resolved. And we make ourselves slaves to our own, the destinies we've set for ourselves rather than
Yeah.
allowing based on past and it's predictive and influential in shaping the future.
Yeah.
Whereas that more receptive undergoing, you think even Desmondian terms, that we live so much in this conatus, this grasping at being where we set the agenda, the parable of the prodigal son. I will set the agenda, getting my inheritance and on my return home, versus the passio, which the son only undergoes as he's coming home, that receiving of who the father is. And you realize the one who was most alienated was in space, was the least alienated because he knew he could come home. But the one with the greatest proximity is the most alienated, does not have that relationship with the father. The conatus versus the passio, and that at work in the parable, in a way that I think all of us are familiar with, but we don't. Forgiveness does not erase the past, but it makes this new present and new future possible.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Yeah. And so in some way, my inclination wasn't to do my best to protect myself from that possibility. It was like, there was something that was just so clear to me that there ain't nothing I'm going to do about that. So there was this kind of surrender to go into relationship with it. There was like a strange, like not a giving up, but openness to encounter it in some way or an orientation in some, although this is all super, super unconscious as a kid, right? However, I can see that kind of adaptation in some way was really related to a deep sense of wonder and opened me up to that sense of wonder in a big way. Like in some sense, really understanding is it Hartman, the sociologist who talks about resonance? He talks about the
Hartmut Rosa. Yeah.
yeah, he's great. Yeah, he's really great. I just encountered his work a few months ago. But when he talks about the ultimate uncontrollability required
Yes.
for resonance to be possible, it's precisely that you cannot control it. You cannot cause it, right? From the carnatus ascendi sense of the word, that it is resonance. Because if you could totally control it and have everything resonate all the time and just the way you want, we call that totalitarianism, right? Resonance has
What?
yes.
It has that. That's when I do this with our first year students, like think of the best day of your life, the best night of your life, the best moments. They will always be with other people and they weren't planned.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Oh,
in the book, I conclude the book putting Charles Taylor and William Desmond in an Irish pub, and the musicians are just starting to play. And you get a sense of this happening, this event, that no one goes to an Irish session. That's when all the musicians get together and they start to play. There is no set list at a session. You don't come in and say, we will play this, and then we will do this, and then that's what the Irish call the crack. Like, it's the life, the joy, the uncertainty, the resonance of the evening unfolds before you because you just say, oh, the newcomer comes in. All right, give us a tune, would you? So the kid starts playing his tin whistle or the flute or knocks a tune out of the fiddle. And then everyone is listening. You're playing along and you're wondering, all right, is he going to take the tune? Is he going to jump to another one? And he does. And maybe it's in a different key and you're like, oh, that's a great transition. And everyone jumps in again and you follow. And then someone sings a song and something else happens. And all of a sudden, you're all breathing together, you're phrasing together, you're resonant, but you didn't plan it. There was no formula for it,
yeah.
but it's alive.
Yeah.
And I think classes are like that. I think relationships have to be like that. This resonance resonance happens. We can set the conditions for it, be open to it,
Yeah.
but we can't plan it or program it.
In fact, this is a subtlety that you really describe in talking about exercises, right? Of exercises and practicing in some sense, being in the metaxu, being aware of the metaxu, having a metaxological way of seeing and mindfulness in some sense. And it's interesting because we were talking about this, like bringing Hartman's notion of like incontrollability for resonance. Of course, that word resonance and the between, that just feels like a congruency that goes like 1,000 miles deep or something.
Yes. I would say Rosa is like the sociologist of the metaxu.
Yeah.
He really,
well
I mean,
said. Well said.
The two of them should just be,
Yeah.
and that's a project on its own. If I had a dissertator doing I'd be like, look, even Desmond, the secondary literature is not vast. The primary literature is sprawling, but you can get your hands around it.
Yeah.
Rosa, the same thing.
Yeah.
You could do a lot with that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
It'd be exciting.
Yeah. These dudes, let's put them in a room together.
That would be a great.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll try to make that happen. Yeah. That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah.
So and I think maybe this is a really good entry point because what you really, I think, have at least communicated to me in reading your book is this real sense in which the metaxu isn't just an idea. It's not just a philosophical notion of the between, right? But it's actually the way that we already always are.
Yes.
In some sense, whether we recognize it or not, it's pointing to a deep way in which we are already constituted in a deep sense as a human being. In what I hear you possibilizing, right, in your work and articulating is that what happens if we actually take that idea and take up our own being with it on purpose and really think through it and really see with it and really begin to consciously and in some sense open ourselves up to the between and the implications of that. And I'm hearing in the incontrollability sense, right, seems to be so central to that co-dwelling in the between.
Absolutely. And so I think I'll in the book talk about like metaxological attunement. And if I were, I look back, I was
Right word.
being through the practice of these spiritual philosophical exercises, coming to inhabit the world in a way that is attuned to the overdeterminacy of being, the too muchness,
Yeah.
the gratuity of existence, our porosity, not only to vertical transcendence, but to the horizontal transcendence around us. And this is where a person like Iris Murdoch, I think, is just so illuminating for us. Murdoch, in one of her early essays published in Sovereignty of Good, will say the enemy of the moral life is the fat, relentless ego. The fat, relentless ego. This hypertrophied, malignant narcissism that forces everything into this constrained shell of the self.
Yeah.
And she says, love is the realization that something other than the self exists. The reality of what is other to the self, that's love. That uncontrollable, like when you look at Rosa, what are the 4 stages of resonance? You have to be affected. So there's a level of porosity that I must be able to be touched.
Yeah.
We have to be moved
Yeah.
by it. There has to be a change within us, this adaptive transformation.
Yeah.
And that's by what is uncontrollable too. I cannot set the agenda for its behavior or its reality.
Yeah.
But it's only in those moments, being affected and moved and changed and drawn into a relationship with what is other to the self and not reducible to the self, that I can find a resonant relationship. That's the metaxu.
Yeah.
And we can see the heinous attempts of trying to obtain mastery over the world.
Yeah.
And through this just unrestrained conatus, that I am the master and maker of all.
Yeah.
The sovereignty of the I
Yeah.
versus, and here's where I think it's helpful, the sovereignty of good, what is transcendent and external to us that magnetically draws us toward itself, the sovereignty of God, sovereignty of the creator,
Yeah.
the holy other.
Yeah. I've got that. There's that sovereignty piece, which seems so important in this relational dynamic and resonance that's possible or not. And I'm hearing is like, there's a way in which you can almost at any moment look at things in terms with being attuned and by the metaxu and attunement with the metaxu. It was and can't think of a moment of, okay, you can't do it right when you're here. That doesn't, not doing it when you're there. It's like this, you're talking about something that you don't ever leave home without in some sense.
I think this is where Desmond, a point that you could draw, like Desmond and Rosa really, I think, get into an interesting conversation. You read, what's Desmond doing? These are dispatches from the heart of the metaxu. And this is a guy who is, as you read, he's telling you about the deepest nature of reality. So you are being affected by what you read, and his invitation is to move you out into it in a way that gets you to see things in anew. There is the transformation, this adaptation, adaptive ability of ourselves to see things in a new way. And what that is doing is creating a resonant relationship with the uncontrollability of the overdetermined ethos in which we live. That beneath every era's reconfigured way, whether it's mechanistic or aesthetic, however you've shaped our ethos, well, that beneath there's still an abiding, pulsing, dynamizing force at work that we can relate to and can be changed by. Like that, I think that's the text as event. It's a revelatory event.
Yes.
And that's where and maybe, now I wouldn't have said this when I was writing the dissertation of the book, but I would say today, what I was trying to serve that formative capacity of Desmond's works.
Yes.
And I think spiritual exercises, again, spiritual exercises do not mean you're going to have the metaxu body when you're all done as much as we'd like, but they do put you in the position to be formed and shaped by those texts
Yeah.
and those experiences.
Yes. This
It's like Wittgenstein's ladder.
Yeah, this positioning, this openness, right, to be affected in some way, or this openness to. I'm thinking of the way that Huber talks about, like, when you go from an I it to an I thou relation, like you have
Yeah.
a half breath's notice. That it's something that you definitely can't control, you can't make happen. But in that, Huber's writing the book, right, itself tells you that there's ways to be open to it, right? This kind of this opening, and that I want to underline this and go a little bit deeper into this notion of being prepared for it, or being in the position to be struck by it, to see it, but not because I think, especially I think Heidegger was amazingly prophetic, right? In his thoughts about technology and in framing and the whole, like how he
Yes.
figured that out so precisely in like the 30s or something, like even distinguishing from echination to like technology, that difference, right? Like that, like, how the hell did he figure that out? But it's so prophetic, especially in that sense where I think most of the people who are listening to this, right, are probably will have a tendency to look at a book like this, or look at the notion of an exercise as some kind of gaining, as some kind of optimizing, as some kind of like maximizing of some sort, or extraction.
Yeah.
Like, even if they're consciously don't want to do that, that's what it is to be in the technological attunement, is like you're already show up attuned to that. So
Yeah.
this kind of openness to it, not the controlling of it. If we could talk about that a little bit more, I think that would be really great.
Of course, you can see behind me, like I use the body workout programs. Now I'm not ripped. I'll never be ripped, but I do my physical exercises modeled for me by a workout guru and a fitness influencer, whatever, Joel
Yeah.
Freeman or Sean T or whatever it's going to be. And there is a way in which you have this idea, like if I follow these steps, then this is the beach body that I will have at the end of 90 days or whatever.
Yeah.
My case, not going to happen, but I like it anyway. Philosophically, I think what you also can get that there are philosophy isn't a body of knowledge that you gain control over as your own standing reserve of information, of gamuts that you then deploy at your enemy or your interlocutor, or pile up to make your case.
Yeah.
Philosophy, those Wittgenstein's ladder, like you're using those as toeholds to describe a reality, but all en route to encountering that reality. So
Counter. Yes.
when we think of spiritual exercises,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there can be more prescriptive, meditative, follow these steps
Yeah.
with the hope that they put you in the position to be rocked back and astonished.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the same time, what they're trying to develop is a contemplative attitude, one that is akin into the spirit of Gelassenheit, one of releasing. I am not trying to master and control. I'm trying to receive and undergo.
Yeah.
For Iris Murdoch, it's being shocked by the beauty of a kestrel outside her window that dissolves her anxiety. And for Descartes, it's the eruptive nature of the thought of the infinite, the thought that cannot be thought by finite thinkers, that exceeds our human capacity. It's for Mary Magdalene and the early disciples, it's the resurrection. This doesn't happen. This cannot happen. It's the impossible that is possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's a way in which I think good philosophy, and Desmond's philosophy makes you slow down. to listen with fresh ears and to interact in a non-controlling way.
Yeah.
And what spiritual exercises do are many and various practices of mindfulness and attunement
Yeah.
that help us to become aware and in relationship with
Yeah.
the innermost depths of creation.
Yeah. Yeah. So as you're talking, I feel this evokes is something like what we're talking about is a different attunement in the Heideggerian sense. Like and also I'm also hearing something like Brahms' notion of being in going from the having mode to the being mode. This modal.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about this is, as my friend who has his own coaching kind of company practice, one of the things that we really share and what we were talking about, and we had a conversation about March is his last name. We were talking about the mystery of how one comes to this kind of more poetic attunement, right? This goes from and shifts, you could say, from a technological attunement to a poetic attunement, right? In the Heideggerian sense of the word.
Yeah.
I'm hearing echoes of this. And one of the things he said that I really appreciated, because it seems so true, is here's the process of getting it. You totally get it. You totally don't get it. You totally get it. You
Yeah.
totally don't get it. You totally get it. You totally don't get it. And it's really, when you hear that, in some sense, he's distinguishing it from this kind of gradual accumulation in a linear progression and all that kind of stuff, that what we're talking about is not an action in the normal kind of Cartesian sense. We're talking about something deeper, right, than that. And therefore being educated, right, into this and learning this is not the same way as one becomes attuned by and to the Bataxu in some sense.
I think you should go back to the Latin root of education, educare, to lead out.
Yeah.
We have to be led out
Huh. Huh.
into,
Yeah.
and then it's what an educator does. The educator invites you out into a broader arena to consider new insights and ideas, new texts and concepts, and show them around. And part of you are then inducting that into your own self and psyche, appropriating it, trying to understand it as it begins to make sense to you. But education begins as a response to being drawn out. And so again, Catholic priest, Holy Spirit,
Yeah.
big in love Jesus, love the
Yeah.
Spirit, love the God.
Yeah.
But I use the Greek poesis and astasis,
Yeah.
that at the work of the Holy Spirit
Yeah.
is a poesis, a making and a remaking.
Yeah.
And in that process of being drawn into this, what is changing is my aesthesis, the way I perceive
Ah.
and interpret the world. And I'm caught in that dipolar, ongoing cycle that is always bringing me deeper and deeper into the depths of the real.
Wow.
That allows me to the aesthesis, the poesis at work in another person. When I remember we have a book coming out in keeping with the idea of spiritual exercises called "Who Will You Become? An Ignatian Introduction to Catholic Theology."
Yeah.
I co-wrote it with my colleague and friend Connor Kelly here at Marquette. But I tell the story of in 2018, 10 days before I came to Marquette to start teaching, newly minted PhD, priest for 3 years. I'm holding my nephew Huey. We were on vacation on the Atlantic Ocean, and I've got Huey in my arms, and my family's laughing and having a good time in the condo. But I'm holding him because he was 3 months old, and could be a little bit fussy. And I was 35 at the time. I'm 36 or whatever. And I'm holding him, and I had this dual moment of this child, not mine. And I remember thinking, when you are my age that I am today, you will think I'm very old. When you're 36 years old. I'll be 72. So you'll think I'm the old man. But I will remember this moment
Yeah.
that I'm holding you and loving you, and you are unique. And I love your brother, and now I love his sister and my other nieces and nephews.
Yes.
And this, what is othered to the self, so precious, so given, but it changes the way you perceive everything.
Yeah.
And that poesis, this thing that was made by my sister and brother-in-law, person, little fella, was himself a making that changed my perceiving. And my perceiving changes the way he will make in the future. Because when I'm with him and attuned to him in a loving, receptive, non-dominative, agapeic way,
Yes.
I'm freeing him
Yes.
for that making to continue, and that will affect others and affect me. And when we're
Wow.
when we see people in that way,
Yeah. Being.
as a making, as a happening,
Yes.
and we attune ourselves to that
Yes.
as the work of the divine
Yes.
in this moment here,
Correct. Yes.
that's not my enemy. That is a child of God who is loved and beloved. And I may find that person to be a big pain in my neck, but I can, below that, there is a making taking place.
It's so well
It's a
said.
very different sense of human dignity.
Yeah. I'm just sensing this in that making, in that reciprocal move back into, what did you call it? That how you see affects how you see things. What did you call? What was the word?
Yeah. Oh, aesthesis and poesis?
Poesis. Yeah. I could
Yeah.
just totally get it in some sense. This, of course, is going to affect how you perceive in such a way that's going to afford a deeper making and attuned making,
Yeah.
which is going to inform your seeing. And I'm really getting this kind of how this anagogic sense of you can start to, like, where the way that you're being in the horizontal starts to climb up into the vertical and becomes more and more present. And a real co-respiration is happening, I think, is
Yeah.
talking about. Yeah.
I love that. I would even go, Rosa does the diagonal. And here I would say, once you recognize that you're caught up in this reciprocal relation, the vectors, the horizontal of how I see the world in the making, and the vertical of how I see the maker at work in the making, it's the diagonal that extends infinitely, and the area covered is all of the cosmos. And I wonder if at times what we're doing is we're thinking, let God be God and where God is, let things be things where things are. And so our area of attunement and reverence is very tiny. But when we see the intimate connection, that intimate strangeness of being that Desmond writes about,
Yeah.
it's the horizontal, the diagonal vector that shoots forth and encompasses. It's all encompassing.
Yeah. And as it shoots forth, it like exponentially covers more and more territory. There's something, I'm really appreciating the way that we're talking about this, because there is one of the things that one of the first things with the circling kind of method, which is basically, if you could think about it, you could say it's a way, an approach to this deep reciprocity with another, right? That deep, that the reciprocal openness. It's a way of doing that we can practice the circling approach in different kind of formations. But one of the biggest things that I continue to hear, and I started hearing it from the very beginnings, the origins, even before we had the word circling, right? Was people talked about this experience of being deeply seen. And it's really interesting the way that you just talked about this as like being seen as a kind of making, right? Like this connection between making and that really poetic poesis in that sense, this seeing in such a way that something is a making, right? Is made there. Like,
Think of, I mean, for Desmond, look at when he talks about being is not static. It's all being is becoming.
yeah,
And
Yeah.
so when we stop seeing I mean, imagine if our language simply reflected, and by language also our concepts and the way we relate to it, but instead of seeing human beings like these, like the being of the phone, this little measurable, circumscribable thing, but were I to see what of my neighbor as a human becoming, and a becoming where I have a role to play in that, and a very important role at that.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. And there's something about, because what's interesting, what's really wild it's always been perplexing to me. Actually, it's been a wonder for me, right? Is what is going on there? What is this? Because a big question, and I wrote some stuff about this because I was trying to work through this question. I was like, what is the difference between something like narcissistic mirroring and the experience of being deeply seen? What fundamentally is that? And as far as I can tell, right, I knew that there was a difference. I just didn't understand. I didn't have an account for that difference, right? And it bugged me. And where I got to with it was that what with, say, narcissistic reification, there's a certain determination that's very precise, right? That's already in
Mhm.
some sense known. There is a way I need to be seen or appreciated or seen as special or whatever the thing is, such that everything that I do is about ensuring that supply. So it's this reflection, right? It's a mirroring of what's I already, in some sense, in a kind of deterministic way, already know or have. But I think when people talk about being deeply seen, right, it's not that like I just mirrored what you already knew and just told me about. It's actually, there's a making here, right? There's a sense of where actually when I say I've been deeply seen, that you apprehended me and beheld me in such a way that went beyond anything I could have conceived. There's an overdeterminacy there, right? In that sense.
There's or like an empowered vulnerability. I
Yeah.
can be who I am without my shields, without my curated image
Yeah.
being the dominant
Yeah.
feature,
Yeah.
but I allow myself to be seen as I am
Yeah.
in a way th that's honest
Yeah.
and unconstrained.
Yeah.
That's and that really is hard,
Yeah. Yeah.
because we're afraid of what will they do if they really know me? But that I know he's not in great repute any longer, but Jean Vanier, I heard once giving a response to his question raised after he won the Templeton Award back 10 or 12 years ago. And he said, the two great questions of our age, does anybody know me? Does anybody care?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think if we see an uptick in forms of narcissistic behavior, it's because we do not trust that people know us or care. And therefore we encapsulate ourselves and we shield ourselves off from being hurt. And that real love, real beholding that sees what is other to the self, what M and D in Iris Murdoch's little parable, that the mother comes to see her daughter-in-law more more fully, progressively more fully. Not like she can count the number of pores on her nose, but she sees the daughter-in-law on the daughter-in-law's terms, as the daughter-in-law is in her, the reality, and what is real and what is becoming can continue to become.
Yes.
So she also sees the potential.
Yes. It,
Narcissists don't see potential. They've got it all sorted.
yeah, totally. And it's that potential, because it usually goes beyond the words. That if I say, I hear you and I get you and I see you this way, it's usually not because I've been correctly informed and fed back the proper information. I may have, there's an element of that. However, there's something that opens, and I think you're getting at it with there's a potential, right? Of
Yeah.
what I actually can't explain to you in some sense is as constituting of me being me. That's why I want to say it's almost like I get a sense of myself as being connected to some kind of moreness in that sense. And that's one of the things that gets seen, not just my attributes or my thingness, but actually my possibility of being a being at all in some sense, my thatness.
Yeah, You can be fussy Thomists. Go back to Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, we cannot exhaust the being of a housefly.
Yeah.
You can't. You could even a housefly. You
Yeah.
couldn't, because to understand and to comprehend completely, you would have to comprehend its endowing creative
Yes.
source.
Yes.
You can't get that taped down. We're not going to do it for one another.
Yes.
And that there's something humbling.
Yeah.
And that's a metaphysic worth adhering to. That what is beyond being, metaphysis, beyond being the endowing source of all that is, the creative source of all that is not one more thing that can be taped down and exhausted. But look at our tendencies, our reductive tendencies as manifested in social media.
Oh, yeah.
Cardinal George, great line. We live in an era when everything is permissible, but nothing is forgivable.
Yeah.
You live your truth. You
Nothing.
say your piece, but the moment you run afoul,
Yeah.
canceled,
Yeah.
not forgivable,
Yeah. Yeah.
because we reduce you to the worst thing you ever did.
Yeah.
What a metaphysically impoverished point. We're irreducible.
I'm really appreciating this conversation. I really felt like
Likewise, this is great.
yeah, like we're really like, we've gone into genuine, what I like to call is genuine dialogos, not just dialogue, but it lifted into dialogos, right? In that the presence of the logos. And I can feel how everything's gathering together, belonging together more articulately beyond what I already understood or could have known. I'm really appreciating our connection and getting to know you and who you are in this conversation this has been really awesome.
Likewise, I'm writing down, I take some notes or I'm putting them into my phone, into the notepad, so that I can come back to this and say, this is rich, or wow, what an interesting way of looking at something.
Yeah.
Because my frustration, as appreciative as I am to go to conferences and academic congresses and such, it turns into it's a lot of monologues.
Yeah.
It's just people talking about, or with Sarah Coakley and I think Hans Josef von Beek used to call theologology, people talking about other people, talking about God.
Yeah.
And what we're doing in this dialogue is we're talking.
Yes.
And new things are being revealed and connections.
Yes.
Like, I never thought about the diagonal vector until today. And I'm like, this is great. I'm excited about it. What can we do with it? How does it help?
Yeah.
And that's thinking. That's the adventure of thought.
Yeah. Yeah. And dialogue. And this is
Yes.
the Metaxu. Here we are.
Yeah. We are citizens of the Metaxu, servants of that mystery.
Absolutely. I really appreciate the thing. And I've heard this from because I went to art school, but have not come to this through academia at all. And I mostly have come to a lot of this through just like my experience and then trying to understand what my language hands couldn't understand at the time, which drew me into Heidegger and philosophy. And then I was like a goner at a certain point. But it always came back to this kind of practice and this kind of relational way of relating that was in some sort of service to. But it's exciting to hear you talk about this kind of distinction between kind of what's happening in academia in the monologuing that happens, and the what can be missing sometimes is that what I'm hearing is the aliveness of the actual dialogue, the sparking, the jazzing, right? The improvising that happens in a conversation. And what's really interesting to me is, I am, I guess, loosely part of this, what is called this little corner of the internet. I think Paul Vanderklay, actually, Pastor Paul Vanderklay, I think, is he the one that termed it? I'm not sure, but he's been the one that's broadcasted the most that I've heard, right? This kind of really motley crew of collective people that are essentially, for all intents and purposes, are dealing with the matter that Desmond is addressing, right? Nihilism, the default atheism, and there are people who are deeply Christian. There are Buddhists. There's John Vervaeke. And I would say it's got this really like head heart quality to it. That's one of the things I've really appreciated about that is because oftentimes those things are often split, right, with people. But in this world, there's got this kind of experiential, like, how do I live my life, right? But also this reaching into what is all that inside of, right? That, and how do I hold that in a world of nihilism, right? How do I confront questions of God?
Yeah.
So this is, what's interesting is I think this is one of the place where technology is actually afforded something, not just the furthering of more technology, but afforded an actual prospering of something fundamentally non-technological called
Yeah.
basically long form dialogue in dialogos. And because we can all find each other now, right? I live in Modesto. I don't know one person I can talk about this with in Modesto, right? California. There's something about this gathering, and it's got a life of its own in a certain sense, in which this is, I think, like a small spark in that greater light that's happening.
To your point, I would say a couple things. Like, this is why I like Thomas Halleck, the Czech priest and theologian, philosopher, psychoanalyst. He writes in a similar way of where he's dealing with these issues of nihilism and despair, depression, social ennui in really compelling ways. But what he's doing, I find, is he's trying to encourage within the church and then with the members of the church a dialogue that, let's be real, like we're in the United States. You can watch, I watch like the Sunday morning news shows. I want to watch Meet the Press and shows like that where we ask our politicians questions and they don't give us answers. They don't dialogue. They give us sound bites, the monologue points. And it's always a gotcha moment. Like every political discourse is just two monologues intended to embarrass the other, it seems, rather than what we can do is, and if maybe we could disagree on lots of things, and I don't think that would take a calamitous turn. I think it would say, I've never thought of it that way, but what about this? Or how would you answer? And I, but the power of the internet and the power of this medium, especially to invite people into the dialogue, and they can leave comments,
Yeah.
and they can send emails, and they can say, "Could I talk to you?"
Yeah.
Like this is how it spreads, and it's not that we think the same thoughts or share the same views, but we're convicted enough that we need to. One of the major points I always think is the issue of despair, of existential despair. And I love the line in Desmond's God in the Between. I think it's chapter 2 or 3. It's on the right-hand side of the page. The annihilation of despair in despair.
Yeah.
That there's a way of submitting to the darkness as a spiritual exercise that paradoxically reawakens our sense of the light.
Yeah.
That of hope, of creation, of goodness, of the divine. And that annihilation of despair in despair. Instead of despairing in despair, I despair and am released from the despair.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it takes the risk. That's the pilgrimage. Desmond, I think a lot of philosophers are really good but they're tour guides.
Yeah.
And they say, now we will look at this and take the snapshot. And I'm going to give you here. It's a pre-framed picture that I'm going to give you. And now we'll go to the next site and pre-framed. But I look at Hadot, I look at Murdoch, I look at William James, I look at Desmond, Karl Rahner, my heroes at least.
Yeah.
Girard.
Yeah.
They're pilgrim thinkers who are like, all right, walk with me for a bit, and we're going to think this through. What's happening to you? Have the experience. And you can send a postcard, but don't try to frame it all.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
You're going to send your dispatches home, but you're being changed.
Yeah.
And now go home and tell the story and invite someone to join you.
Yeah.
And that's what you've done. You're inviting people to be part of the story.
I love that. I love that. All right, my friend, could you do me a favor when those 2 hours just flew by?
Yeah, no kidding.
Maybe this just be the beginning. We have more to cover with your book that I want to cover with you.
We're meeting again tomorrow, right?
Yeah, we're meeting with Desmond and Stephen Kepner. Is that how you say his last name?
Kemper.
Kepper.
KN. Yeah.
And himself, right? For a 4-way dialogue And I want to put the notion of idiocy or the idiotics that I think is a real something that's super slippery. But I think I get it. And then it's like one of those things that I go to describe it. And I'm like, I slips out of my fingers and then I think I get it. And I sense something in what Desmond is bringing into relief that hasn't been totally brought into relief in the way he's doing. There's something distinct going on. I want to circle around.
He gets, it's in so many ways richer than Dasein. It's Dasein on metaxological steroids, I think.
Yeah, totally.
It's Dasein truly aware of being in the world, being in relation to others. It'll be sexy. We're going to have a great time tomorrow.
Yeah, totally. Okay, great. We're going to have a great time tomorrow. And see, do me a favor. If there's any links that you would like me to put on the show notes of if people want to reach you or where to find your work or anything like that, that the audience could get to know you more and your work more, that'd be great.
Happily. I will do that. I'll send that to you in a few minutes.
Great. Thank you so much, my friend. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
Right
I'll
on.
see you tomorrow. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.